Sauron is the title character and the primary antagonist, through the forging of the One Ring, of J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, where he rules the land of Mordor and has the ambition of ruling the whole of Middle-earth. In the same work, he is identified as the necromancer of Tolkien's earlier novel The Hobbit. The Silmarillion describes him as the chief lieutenant of the first Dark Lord, Morgoth. Tolkien noted that the Ainur, the angelic powers of his constructed myth, were capable of many degrees of error and failing, but by far the worst was the absolute satanic rebellion and evil of Morgoth and his satellite Sauron. Sauron appears most often as the Eye, as if disembodied. Tolkien, while denying that absolute evil could exist, stated that Sauron came as near to a wholly evil will as was possible. Commentators have compared Sauron to the title character of Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula, and to Balor of the Evil Eye in Celtic mythology. Sauron is briefly seen in a humanoid form in Peter Jackson's film trilogy, which otherwise shows him as a disembodied, flaming eye. Fictional history. Before the world's creation, the Ainulindal, the cosmological myth prefixed to the Silmarillion, explains how the supreme being Eru initiated his creation by bringing into being innumerable good, immortal, angelic spirits, the Ainur, including Sauron, one of the lesser Ainur, the Mayor. In his origin, Sauron therefore perceived the Creator directly. He was of a far higher order than the Mayor who later came to Middle-earth as the wizards, such as Gandalf and Saruman. The Vala Melkor rebelled against Eru, breaking the cosmic music that Eru had used in the world's creation with discord. So began the evils of the world, which Sauron continued. Sauron's fall in the First Age. Servant of all. Lieutenant of Morgoth. The Rings of Power in the Second Age. About 500 years into the Second Age, Sauron reappeared, intent on taking over Middle-earth and ruling it as a god-king. To seduce the elves into his service, Sauron assumed a fair appearance as Anator, Lord of Gifts, befriended the elven smiths of Eregion, led by Celebrimbor, and counseled them in arts and magic. With Sauron's assistance, the elven smiths forged the Rings of Power. He then secretly forged the One Ring, to rule all other rings, in the volcanic Mount Doom in Mordor. The elves detected his influence when he put on the One Ring, and removed their rings. Enraged, Sauron initiated a great war and conquered much of the land west of Anduin. Sauron overran Eregion, killed Celebrimbor, and seized the 7 and the 9 Rings of Power. The 3 rings were saved by the elves, specifically Gil-galad, Círdan, and Galadriel. Sauron besieged Imladris, battled Hazad-dûm and Lothlorien, and pushed further into Gil-galad's realm. The elves were saved when a powerful army from Númenor arrived to their aid, defeating Sauron's forces and driving the remnant back to Mordor. Sauron fortified Mordor and completed the Dark Tower of Barad-dûr. He distributed the remaining rings of the 7 and the 9 to lords of dwarves and men, respectively. Dwarves proved too resilient to bend to his will, but he enslaved men as the Nazgûl, his most feared servants. Orcs and trolls became his servants, along with Easterlings and men of Harad. Downfall of Númenor. War of the Last Alliance. Third Age. Sauron spent 1,000 years as a shapeless, dormant evil. A few years after the War of the Last Alliance, Isildur's army was ambushed by orcs at the Gladden Fields. Isildur put on the ring and attempted to escape by swimming across Anduin, but the ring, trying to return to Sauron, slipped from his finger. Isildur was killed by orc archers. The Necromancer of Dol Guldur. The War of the Ring. Appearance. Physical body. Tolkien never described Sauron's appearance in detail, though he painted a watercolor illustration of him. Sarah Crown, in The Guardian, wrote that we're never ushered into his presence, we don't hear him speak. All we see is his influence. She called it a bold move, to leave the book's central evil so undefined and edgeless darkness given shape only through the actions of its subordinates, with the result that he becomes truly unforgettable, vaster, bolder, and more terrifying through his absence than he could ever have been through his presence. He was initially able to change his appearance at will, but when he became Morgotha's servant, he took a sinister shape. In the First Age, the outlaw Gorlim was ensnared and brought into the dreadful presence of Sauron, who had daunting eyes. In the battle with Huon, the Hound of Valinor, Sauron took the form of a werewolf. Then he assumed a serpent-like form, and finally changed back from monster to his own accustomed form. He took on a beautiful appearance at the end of the First Age to charm Ianwe, near the beginning of the Second Age when appearing as Anator to the elves, and again near the end of the Second Age to corrupt the men of Numenor. He appeared then as a man, or one in man's shape, but greater than any even of the race of Numenor in stature. And it seemed to men that Sauron was great, though they feared the light of his eyes. To many he appeared fair, to others terrible, but to some evil. After the destruction of his fair form in the fall of Numenor, Sauron always took the shape of a terrible dark lord. His first incarnation after the downfall of Numenor was hideous, an image of malice and hatred made visible. Isildur recorded that Sauron's hand was black, and yet burned like fire. Eye of Sauron. Throughout the Lord of the Rings, the eye is the image most often associated with Sauron. Sauron's orcs bore the symbol of the eye on their helmets and shields, and referred to him as the Eye because he did not allow his name to be written or spoken, according to Aragorn. The Lord of the Nazgul threatened Eowyn with torture before the lidless eye at the Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Frodo had a vision of the eye in the Mirror of Galadriel. The eye was rimmed with fire, but was itself glazed, yellow as a cat's, watchful and intent, and the black slit of its pupil opened on a pit, a window into nothing. Later, Tolkien writes as if Frodo and Sam really glimpsed the eye directly. The mists surrounding Barad-dûr are briefly withdrawn, and one moment only it stared out, as from some great window immeasurably high there stabbed northward a flame of red, the flicker of a piercing eye. The eye was not turned on them, it was gazing north, but Frodo at that dreadful glimpse fell as one stricken mortally. This raises the question of whether an eye was Sauron's actual manifestation, or whether he had a body beyond the eye. Gollum tells Frodo that Sauron has, at least, a black hand with 4 fingers. The missing finger was cut off when Isildur took the ring, and the finger was still missing when Sauron reappeared centuries later. Tolkien writes in the Silmarillion that the eye of Sauron the terrible few could endure even before his body was lost in the War of the Last Alliance. In the draft text of the climactic moments of The Lord of the Rings, the eye stands for Sauron's very person, with emotions and thoughts. The Dark Lord was suddenly aware of him, the eye piercing all shadows. Its wrath blazed like a sudden flame and its fear was like a great black smoke, for it knew its deadly peril, the thread upon which hung its doom. T.s. thought was now bent with all its overwhelming force upon the mountain. Christopher Tolkien comments, the passage is notable in showing the degree to which my father had come to identify the Eye of Barad-dûr with the mind and will of Sauron, so that he could speak of its wrath, its fear, its thought. In the second text, he shifted from its to his as he wrote out the passage anew. Concept and creation. Since the earliest versions of the Silmarillion legendarium as detailed in the History of Middle-earth series, Sauron underwent many changes. The prototype or precursor Sauron figure was a giant monstrous cat, the Prince of Cats. Called Tevildo, Tifil, and Tiberth among other names, this character played the role later taken by Sauron in the earliest version of the story of Búrin and Tinúviel in the Book of Lost Tales in 1917. The Prince of Cats was later replaced by Thursday, the Necromancer. The name was then changed to Gorthu, Sir, and finally to Sauron. Gorthu, in the form Gorthor, remained in the Silmarillion. Both Thursday and Sauron name the character in the 1925 Lay of Lúthien. The story of Beren and Lúthien also features the heroic Hound Huan and involved the subtext of cats versus dogs in its earliest form. Later the cats were changed to wolves or werewolves, with the Sauron figure becoming the Lord of Werewolves. Before the publication in 1977 of the Silmarillion, Sauron's origins and true identity were unclear to those without access to Tolkien's notes. In 1968, the poet W. H. Auden conjectured that Sauron might have been one of the Vala. Interpretations. Holy evil will. Tolkien stated in his letters that although he did not think absolute evil could exist as it would be zero, in my story Sauron represents as near an approach to the holy evil will as is possible. He explained that, like all tyrants, Sauron had started out with good intentions but was corrupted by power, and that he went further than human tyrants in pride and the lust for domination, being in origin an immortal spirit. He began as Morgoth's servant, became his representative, in his absence in the Second Age, and at the end of the Third Age actually claimed to be Morgoth returned. Destructive Dracula figure. Gwyneth Hood, writing in Mythlore, compares Sauron to Count Dracula from Bram Stoker's 1897 novel Dracula. In her view, both of these monstrous antagonists seek to destroy, are linked to powers of darkness, are parasitical on created life, and are undead. Both control others psychologically and have hypnotic eyes. Control by either of them represents high spiritual terror as it is a sort of damnation on earth. Celtic Balor of the Evil Eye. Edward Lentz, also writing in Mythlore, identifies a figure from Celtic mythology, Balor of the Evil Eye, as a possible source for the Eye of Sauron. Balor's evil eye, in the middle of his forehead, was able to overcome a whole army. He was king of the evil Fomor, who like Sauron were evil spirits in hideously ugly bodies. Lentz further compares Mordor to a Celtic hell, just as the undying lands of Aman resemble the Celtic earthly paradise of Tir na Nog in the furthest west, and Balor ruled the dead from a tower of glass. Antagonist. The Tolkien scholar Verlin Flieger writes that if there was an opposite to Sauron in The Lord of the Rings, it would not be Aragorn, his political opponent, nor Gandalf, his spiritual enemy, but Tom Bombadil, the earthly master who is entirely free of the desire to dominate and hence cannot be dominated. Adaptations. Film. In film versions of The Lord of the Rings, Sauron has been left off-screen as an invisible and unvisualizable antagonist as in Ralph Bakshi's 1978 animated version, or as a disembodied eye, as in Rankin/Bass 1980 animated adaptation of The Return of the King. In the 2001-2003 film trilogy directed by Peter Jackson, Sauron is voiced by Alan Howard. He is briefly shown as a large humanoid figure clad in black armor, portrayed by Sala Baker, but appears only as the disembodied eye throughout the rest of the storyline. In earlier versions of Jackson's script, Sauron does battle with Aragorn, as shown in the extended DVD version of The Lord of the Rings, The Return of the King. The scene was removed as too large a departure from Tolkien's text and was replaced with Aragorn fighting a troll. Sauron appears as the necromancer in Jackson's The Hobbit film adaptations, where he is voiced by Benedict Cumberbatch. Sauron appears in the form of his eye in the Lego Batman movie voiced by Jermaine Clement. He is one of the many pre-existing villains the Joker frees from the Phantom Zone to run amok in Gotham City. Television. Sauron's rise to power in the Second Age is portrayed in the Amazon Prime prequel series The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. He appears disguised as the non-canonical character Halbrand, played by Charlie Vickers. Video games. Sauron appears in the merchandise of the Jackson films, including computer and video games. These include The Lord of the Rings, The Battle for Middle-earth 2, The Lord of the Rings, Tactics, and The Lord of the Rings, The Third Age. In the Lord of the Rings online game, he is featured as an enemy. In culture, the nickname Eye of Sauron has been given to multiple eye-like objects, namely the planetary nebulae M1-42 and Helix Nebula, the star system HR 4796A, and the intermediate spiral Seyfert galaxy NGC 4151. Also in astronomy, the Sauron project is an integral field spectrograph for the William Herschel telescope with a large field of view and high throughput for study of nearby early-type galaxies. In zoology, the Sauron genus of linyphiid sheet weaver spiders is named after him. The Eye of Sauron is mentioned in The Stand, a post-apocalyptic novel written by Stephen King. The villain Randall Flagg possesses an astral body in the form of an eye akin to the lidless eye. The novel itself was conceived by King as a fantasy epic like The Lord of the Rings, only with an American setting. The idea of Sauron as a sleepless eye that watches and seeks the protagonists also influenced King's epic fantasy series The Dark Tower. Its villain, the Crimson King, is a similarly disembodied evil presence whose icon is also an eye. In the Marvel Comics universe, the supervillain Sauron, an enemy of the X-Men, names himself after the Tolkien character. In the comic series Fables, by Bill Willingham, one character is called the Adversary, an ambiguous figure of immense evil and power believed to be responsible for much of the misfortune in the Fables' overall history. Willingham has stated the Adversary, in name and in character, was inspired by Sauron. Einar Sauron and Einar Narsil, a Russian-based Android audio modification tool, were named after Sauron and Narsil. Notes